The glass hit Marcus Webb's chest before he could react. Not handed. Pressed. The way you press something into a wall. Vice Admiral Charles Davenport didn't even look at him. Just extended his arm sideways, spotted the black man in the dark suit near the window, and pushed the empty glass into his chest, like Marcus was furniture placed there for exactly this purpose. "Hey, you there. Yeah, you the black guy standing in the corner like you're lost. Take this back and bring me a real drink. Something that costs more than you make in a week." The group laughed. Davenport was already back in his story before the echo faded. Then Beckett leaned toward Ashford loud enough for the whole table. "Chuck, I think your server's confused. Maybe this is the fanciest place he's ever been." More laughter. Easy laughter. The kind that costs nothing. Marcus set the glass on a passing tray. Said nothing. Didn't move. That's when Davenport turned around. Smiled slow. "Still here. I like the confidence, son. But rooms like this have a dress code. And I don't mean the suit. You don't have it. You never will." He patted Marcus once on the shoulder, the way you pat a lost child, and walked away. Marcus didn't flinch. Didn't speak. Just stood there, still patient. The kind of calm that doesn't come from weakness. It comes from knowing exactly what you've done. The man who just said he'd never belong had been alive for 14 years, because Marcus Webb decided he was worth saving. Before midnight, every person in that ballroom was going to learn what that meant. Don't go anywhere, this story gets heavier before it gets right. Drop your city and local time in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, now you know what you've been missing. The annual Navy Distinguished Service Gala had been held at the Charleston Convention Center every October for 22 consecutive years. The ballroom on the 4th floor Palmetto Hall seated 300 comfortably and 240 uncomfortably, which was exactly how many invitations had been sent this year. The fire marshal's number was posted on the wall near the service entrance. Nobody looked at it. By 7:15 on a Friday evening, the room was already running at full pressure. Chandeliers threw gold light across a sea of dress whites and navy blues. Ribbons stacked 4 and 5 rows deep on chests that had bled in 3 different theaters. The air carried brass polish, expensive cologne, and the particular tension of a room where every handshake was a transaction and every compliment was a calculation. Waiters in black vests moved between round tables draped in white linen, carrying trays of champagne and sparkling water, with the careful efficiency of people who understood that invisibility was their most important professional skill tonight. Each place setting held a program embossed in gold. Names, ranks, service records printed in clean serif font like resumes for people who had already won. At the center of it all, one man made the room arrange itself around him without asking. Vice Admiral Charles Davenport. 58 years old, silver hair cut tight to the skull, jaw set in the permanent half-smile of a man who had walked into enough rooms to know that every room eventually became his. 3 combat deployments, a Silver Star whose ribbon had faded at the edges from 34 years of service. When Davenport spoke, people leaned in. When he paused, they waited. His laugh cut through every other sound in the room, the way a rifle shot cuts through wind, sudden, total, impossible to ignore. Captain Reed Ashford held his right flank. Lean, precise, the kind of officer who finished Davenport's sentences 2 beats early and nodded before the thought was complete. Commander Troy Beckett held the left 3 bourbons into the evening, already loud enough to draw looks from the adjacent table, the kind of loud that mistook volume for authority and had been doing so for 20 years. Marcus Webb arrived at 7:23. He came through the main entrance alone. Dark suit, no medals, no ribbons, no name badge announcing his rank or his history. His hair was cut clean, his shoes were polished to a mirror finish, and the only jewelry he wore was a thin silver watch on his left wrist that had belonged to his father. He looked to anyone who glanced his way, like a quiet man who had perhaps wandered into the wrong event. A civilian guest, a local official, someone's brother-in-law filling a seat. He paused at the threshold for exactly 2 seconds. His eyes moved left to right across the room in a pattern so practiced it had long ago stopped being conscious. Entry points, exit routes, elevated positions, blind spots, choke points. The scan was complete before most people in the room had finished their current sentence. Nobody caught it. Nobody was trained to catch it, except one man sitting alone at a corner table who watched the scan happen and went very still. Marcus took a glass of water from the nearest tray. Not champagne, not wine. Water. Then he crossed to the far wall, the one with the tall windows overlooking the harbor, and stood with his back to the glass facing the entire room. Old habit. The kind that gets written into muscle memory after enough years of operating in spaces where the wrong position gets you killed. A few people glanced at him. Some curious, some less charitable. A woman in a red dress leaned toward her husband and said something behind her program. A commander near the bar looked twice, decided Marcus wasn't significant, and turned back to his drink. Across the ballroom, Davenport noticed him, the black man in the plain dark suit, standing alone near the windows. No uniform, no companion. No apparent reason to exist in the orbit of 200 decorated officers. Davenport tilted his chin toward Ashford and said something low. Ashford looked over, assessed Marcus in under a second, and smirked. That was when Davenport walked over. That was the moment already described. The glass pressed into Marcus's chest. The 3 sentences that were designed not to inform, but to diminish. The pat on the shoulder that said, "You are not a person in this room. You are an obstacle that needs redirecting." And Marcus had stood there and taken it not because he had no choice, but because he had already made his choice a long time ago about which battles were worth the energy of engagement. He set the glass on the passing tray and returned to his position by the window. He had been standing there for 11 minutes when the man sat down at the small table nearest the window, a two-top that had been empty all evening, and said without preamble, without introduction, "You chose that spot on purpose." Marcus looked at him. Master Chief Petty Officer Leonard Grimes, late 50s. Built like a fire hydrant someone had left out in 30 years of weather. His dress uniform carried the quiet weight of a man who had earned everything on it slowly and didn't feel the need to explain any of it. He had the kind of face that had stopped being readable sometime around his 3rd deployment and never fully reopened. He wasn't looking at Marcus when he spoke. He was looking at the room, specifically at the 2 exits, the main stage and the VIP table where Davenport had resettled into his circle. The exact same points Marcus had been tracking. "You chose that spot on purpose," Grimes said again. Not a question. Back to the glass. Clear sight lines to both exits and the stage. Nobody approaches from behind. That's not a civilian choice. Marcus said nothing. Grimes finally looked at him. His expression was not curiosity. It was recognition. "Saw what happened earlier," he said quietly. "It's fine," Marcus said. "No," Grimes said. "It isn't." They sat in silence for a moment, 2 men watching the same room with the same eyes for reasons nobody else in the ballroom could begin to understand. On the stage at the front, the podium was being tested. Captain Sandra Howell, the evening's MC, was shuffling papers and adjusting the microphone height. The program listed the night's events, opening remarks, dinner service, keynote address, and a special recognition ceremony for the program. Read a veteran whose service record stands among the most remarkable in the modern history of naval special warfare. Marcus had read that line when he first sat down. He had assumed it referred to someone at the VIP table, someone with stars on their shoulders and a chest full of metal. He did not know it referred to him. He did not know that the man who had just patted him on the shoulder like a lost child was the same man whose life he had saved on a rooftop 14 years ago. He did not know that before this evening ended, 200 officers were going to rise to their feet in this room. For him, Davenport didn't walk toward Marcus. He marched. The way a man moves when he has already decided the outcome of a conversation before a single word has been spoken, chin forward, shoulders squared, weight loaded into each step like punctuation. Ashford and Beckett fell in 2 steps behind without being asked, a formation they had practiced without ever being told to. The Admiral's entourage, his echo chamber in dress whites, 3 men crossing a ballroom toward one man standing alone by a window with a glass of water and no uniform. Marcus tracked the approach the way he tracked everything: angles, distance, intent. He had 3 seconds before they arrived. He used them to breathe once slowly from the diaphragm, the breath that preceded every trigger pull of his professional life. Not preparation for violence, preparation for stillness. Davenport stopped 4 feet away, close enough to use his height, close enough that the chandelier light fell behind him, putting his face in partial shadow and forcing Marcus to look up slightly. Whether Davenport knew the geometry of it or not, he had positioned himself for maximum physical dominance. He looked Marcus over, head to toe. The way a man inspects something he has already decided doesn't belong on his property. "I know every face worth knowing in this room," Davenport said. "I don't know yours." "Marcus Webb," Marcus said. "I served Naval Special Warfare, 14 years. The silence that followed lasted exactly 1 second. Then Davenport laughed. Not a chuckle, not a polite exhale. A full head-back, chest-shaking roar that bounced off the chandeliers and turned heads from 5 tables away. The kind of laugh designed to carry, designed to be heard. The kind that says, "I have found something absurd, and I want witnesses." "Special warfare," he repeated, wiping the corner of his eye with one knuckle. "Son, which part? Driving the boats, folding the maps." Ashford's smile arrived on cue. "Maybe he ran the coffee station at the schoolhouse." Beckett, 3 bourbons deep filter fully disengaged, snorted. "NSW had a janitor division. Nobody briefed me on that. They fed off each other. The way men do in a circle when the target has been established and the performance has begun. Each one pushing the next slightly further, each laugh landing permission for the next comment to go a degree harder. This was not a conversation. This had never been a conversation. This was a demonstration conducted in front of 200 people of who belonged in this room and who did not. The room was watching. A colonel at the nearest table glanced over, then slowly looked down at his plate. His wife touched his arm. Not in solidarity, in warning. "Don't get involved." A commander 2 tables back turned his shoulder slightly, angling away from the scene the way you angle away from something you don't want to be asked about later. Ensign Kevin Tran, 23 years old and 4 months out of Annapolis, stood at the bar with a glass halfway to his lips, his mouth open, something forming behind his eyes. Then the glass went back down and his gaze went to the floor. Nobody spoke. 200 officers in a room built on the words honor, courage, commitment. Not one of them could locate any of the 3. Davenport stepped closer. His voice dropped low, private, the frequency men use when they want words to bruise without leaving visible marks. "Let me be honest with you. I've spent 34 years building what's in this room. I know what service looks like. I know what it smells like. I know what it costs." He paused. "And whatever you did, if you did anything, it wasn't this. So why don't you find a seat somewhere quiet and let the adults finish their evening?" That was Rage Beat 1. Clean, precise, delivered with the confidence of a man who had never once been held accountable for what came out of his mouth in a room like this. Marcus held his gaze, flat, patient. The look of a man who had once held a fixed position for 16 hours in a drainage ditch without moving a single muscle, breathing through his diaphragm, waiting for the one moment that mattered. This was not that moment. He knew it. He waited. "All right," Marcus said. "One word. No heat. No retreat. No concession." Davenport studied him for 2 seconds, looking for the flinch that wasn't coming, then snorted and turned on his heel. Ashford and Beckett followed, already redirecting their attention to the next drink, the next conversation, the next person beneath their notice. The ballroom noise resumed. Glasses clinked. Laughter rippled across the room like nothing had happened, because for most of the people in it, nothing had. But Ashford, settling back into his chair at the VIP table, leaned toward Beckett and spoke at a volume calibrated for the table around them. "Chuck's been running SEAL teams since before half these people figured out which way to hold a rifle. You know what kills me? They let anybody in now. Anybody at all." He glanced once toward Marcus. No attempt at subtlety, no need for it, and smiled before turning away. That was Rage Beat 4. And it landed in the room with a different weight than Davenport's words. Because Davenport had the cover of rank. Ashford had nothing but contempt, and he was wearing it openly in public in front of witnesses because he had calculated that no one would say anything. He was right. Marcus stood by the window. His water glass was steady in his hand. His pulse was even. His expression had not changed. But his right hand, the one nobody was watching, had closed into a fist so tight that the knuckles had gone pale against his dark skin. Marcus Elijah Webb had held still in worse places than this. He had held still with rounds coming in from 3 directions, and the temperature dropping, and the radio dead, and 8 men's lives sitting on the other side of his trigger finger. He could hold still in a ballroom. He could hold still a little longer. Marcus Elijah Webb was born in Selma, Alabama, on a Tuesday morning in March, in a hospital that had only recently stopped directing black patients to a separate entrance around the back. His father, James Webb, was 51 years old when Marcus arrived, a Korean War veteran who had come home in 1953 to a country that pinned a medal on his chest at the base and then told him to use a different water fountain at the bus station on the way home. James never talked about the war. He talked about the water fountain. He said it told him more about what he was fighting for than anything that had happened in Korea. James worked at a hardware store on Broad Street for 31 years. He knew every customer by name. He extended credit to people the bank wouldn't touch. He closed early on Sundays without posting a sign because everyone already knew. When he died, 214 people came to the funeral. Black, white, every variation of the town's complicated history standing in the same room, which James would have considered the finest thing he ever built. His mother, Ruth, taught 9th grade mathematics at Selma High School for 27 years. She was the kind of teacher students came back to visit a decade later, not to report their successes, but to say thank you for the specific Tuesday afternoon when she had refused to let them quit. She kept a Bible on her desk and a grade book that she updated in red pen with a precision that Marcus would later recognize as identical to the way he maintained his field logs. Marcus learned to shoot at 9 years old. His father took him to a flat stretch of land behind the hardware store's storage building on a Saturday morning in April, set up 6 tin cans on a fence post, and put a .22 rifle in his hands, with no ceremony and very little instruction. "Breathe out," James said. "Then pull. Don't push. Pull." Marcus missed the first 4 cans, hit the 5th, hit the 6th. His father nodded once. "One shot, one answer. Everything else is noise." By 12, Marcus could hit a moving target at 200 yards. By 15, he could account for wind drift and bullet drop without a calculation. He felt it the way musicians feel. Time not as measurement, but as sensation. His father watched him shoot and said nothing for a long time. Then one evening he said, "You have a gift. Gifts are debts. You pay them forward or they rot." As Marcus enlisted in the United States Navy the week after his 18th birthday, the recruiter in Montgomery, a pale man in his mid-40s, with the particular energy of someone who had filled the same quotas for 17 years, looked at Marcus across the desk. Young black man, 18 years old. Selma, Alabama. He pulled up the standard matrix and began directing the conversation toward logistics. Supply chain, vehicle maintenance, administrative support. Marcus listened to the full presentation. Then he said, "I want combat support." The recruiter's expression didn't change. His pen moved to a different column. "Son, those pipelines are extremely competitive. The washout rates—" "I understand the washout rates," Marcus said. "I want combat support." The recruiter looked at him for a moment. Then he initialed the form. Boot camp at Great Lakes was where the first whispers started. The quiet kid from Alabama, who could outshoot every man in his platoon, not by a margin, by a distance that made the range instructors stop talking and start watching. Qualification day. Marcus put every round inside the 10 ring, while the men around him were still adjusting their sights. The drill instructor, a 22-year veteran named Chief Holloway, watched him shoot without a word. Then he walked to the base commander's office and made a phone call that lasted 11 minutes. 2 weeks later, Marcus received orders he had not expected. Scout Sniper School, the pipeline. The crucible that broke 71% of the men who attempted it. That had, according to the school's unofficial record, never been completed by a black man from the rural South, a fact nobody stated officially and everyone understood implicitly. Marcus arrived at the schoolhouse with one duffel bag. He did not know about the unofficial record. Nobody told him. He simply showed up and began. The other candidates looked at him the way Davenport had looked at him tonight. The calibration was instant and identical, the assessment that someone had made an administrative error, that the natural order would reassert itself within a week, that the correction was coming, and patience was all that was required. It never came. Marcus passed every phase: long-range marksmanship, stalking, observation, fieldcraft. He excelled not because he was stronger than the men around him, he was not, but because he was more patient, more still, more willing to lie in a fixed position for 14 hours, without moving, breathing through his diaphragm, letting everything irrelevant pass by like weather, saving all attention for the single moment that mattered. By week 7, his instructors had stopped calling him Webb. They called him Phantom, because he completed field exercises and the recovery teams couldn't determine where he had been. Because he could establish a hide site 30 yards from an observation team and remain undetected for 3 days while they searched for him with thermal optics. Because he moved through terrain the way absence moves through a room, you only notice it when you realize something should be there and isn't. The name followed him out of the schoolhouse and into the operational world. In week 9 of the pipeline, an instructor's field note later reproduced in Marcus's qualification file read, "Candidate Webb completed the 72-hour stalking exercise. Hide site recovered at 0600. He had maintained position for 67 consecutive hours. Thermal scan recorded core body temperature at 94.2 degrees Fahrenheit, upon extraction borderline hypothermic. When asked if he required medical evaluation, Candidate Webb said, "I'm fine. Did I pass?" He passed. 67 hours without movement. 94.2 degrees. No medical intervention requested, none accepted. Physiologically, The numbers sat at the outer edge of what the human body tolerates before it begins making decisions without permission. Special warfare physicians who reviewed the file later disagreed about whether it was possible. The file existed regardless. Marcus served 14 years after the schoolhouse. 3 deployments. 11 Tier 1 classified operations. A confirmed kill at 2,280 yards, nighttime 23-mile-per-hour crosswind through a 4-inch gap in a reinforced concrete wall. A shot that required calculating bullet drift, atmospheric density, and the Coriolis effect simultaneously. The record sat unchallenged. The geometry of it was still being argued about in special warfare circles years later by men who had never met him and didn't know his name. They only knew the call sign. Phantom. And the mission that connected that name to the man currently standing alone by the window in a Charleston ballroom. The mission that would bring a Vice Admiral to his knees before the evening was over was called Operation Black Current. The classified file on Operation Black Current was 47 pages long. Most of those pages were redacted. Black bars covered names, coordinates, dates, the specific country where it happened, a country Marcus could not name in a bar, could not reference in a conversation, could not acknowledge having set foot in without a legal process that would take longer than the operation itself. What remained visible in the unclassified summary was a sequence of facts stripped of all human weight printed in 12-point courier on government paper, the language of bureaucracy, applied to the worst night of 8 men's lives. The summary read as follows: 8-man SEAL team. Nighttime coastal extraction. Target acquired exfiltration route confirmed, timeline locked. At 22:14 hours, the extraction route was compromised. The team moved to secondary. At 22:31, secondary was compromised. At 22:47, the team entered a harbor district on foot, a dense civilian corridor of shipping warehouses and service roads running parallel to the waterline, and was ambushed from 3 elevated positions simultaneously. Communications jammed. Air support requested and denied nearest available asset was 43 minutes out. Medical support was 43 minutes out. Everything was 43 minutes out. Survival window 8 minutes. The team leader's subsequent after-action report described the harbor district in language that had been stripped of classification but not of honesty. We were in a drainage channel between 2 warehouse structures, rounds incoming from the roof to the north, the loading dock to the east, and an elevated catwalk to the west. We had suppressive fire capability, but no angle on any of the 3 positions. We had wounded. We had no extraction and no communication. At approximately 22:52, I assessed our probability of survival at approximately 0 and began preparing final transmissions. That was the moment. 22:52. 8 men in a drainage channel. 3 hostile positions. Final transmissions being prepared. Marcus Webb was on a rooftop 1,640 yards to the north. He had been there for 11 hours. He had arrived before sunset, established his hide, settled into position, and waited with the particular quality of stillness that his instructors had named and his enemies had never survived. His communications were dark, jammed along with everything else in the district. He had no orders. He had no confirmation of friendly positions. He had no authorization to engage. What he had was a line of sight, and 8 men who had approximately 6 minutes left. Rage Beat 2 lived in the next paragraph of the official file, a single sentence, clinical and devastating in its brevity. Call sign Phantom operated outside authorized engagement parameters for the duration of the engagement. Outside authorized parameters, the language of bureaucracy covering the fact that Marcus had been explicitly told to hold position, maintain observation, do not engage without confirmation. The language that would have been used to discipline him if the 8 men had walked out alive and someone needed a procedural violation to process. They walked out alive. Nobody processed anything. Marcus acquired the first target rooftop to the north at 22:53. Wind from the southwest at 23 miles per hour. Temperature dropping. Distance 1,640 yards. He made the adjustments that 11 years of fieldwork had made: automatic elevation, windage, atmospheric density, the slight eastward pull of the Earth's rotation at this latitude. He exhaled. He waited for the pause between heartbeats that every sniper learns to find, the half-second of absolute stillness that the body offers between one pulse and the next. He pulled. The first target was down before the sound of the shot reached the drainage channel. He was already acquiring the second loading dock to the east, partially obscured a 4-second window between movements. He used 3 of them. The second target was down. Third, the elevated catwalk to the west, the hardest angle, a position that required him to adjust for the downhill trajectory, and the catwalk's metal grating, which would affect bullet stability if he was off by a fraction. He was not off by a fraction. Third target down. He had been working for 9 seconds. The fourth hostile position revealed itself in response to the third shot. A shooter who had been stationary behind a shipping container on the eastern perimeter broke position and moved. Movement was information. Marcus tracked, calculated, pulled. Fourth target down. 16 seconds. 4 kills. The ambush collapsed. The remaining hostile elements withdrew. The discipline of an ambush depends on its positions, holding, and 3 of 4 positions had ceased to exist in under 20 seconds. The team leaders after action would later note, at 22:53, all incoming fire ceased simultaneously from the northern and eastern positions. At 22:54, the western position was neutralized. At 22:55, we had a clear extraction corridor. I do not know how. I know that someone on a rooftop somewhere decided that 8 lives were worth whatever it was going to cost them. 0 casualties. Full extraction. 43 minutes later, air support arrived over a harbor district that no longer needed it. The team leader filed the after-action report the following morning. At the bottom in the section reserved for commendations and requests, he wrote, "Request immediate identification and recognition of call sign Phantom. He saved every life on this team, every single one. Whatever he did to make that shot, whatever rules he broke to take it, this team would not exist without him. I want to find him. I want to say thank you." The request was denied. The file was sealed at a classification level, requiring Joint Congressional and Secretary of the Navy authorization to open. The team received their medals. Their debrief was thorough and confidential. When they asked about Phantom, and they asked every one of them in every debrief, they were told the same thing. That information is not available at this time. The team leader's name printed at the bottom of the after-action report, in the same 12-point courier, as everything else, was Lieutenant Commander Charles R. Davenport. Marcus served 9 more years after Black Current. He never spoke of it. He retired at 34, moved to Charleston, and took the groundskeeper position at the Veterans Memorial Park on the waterfront. The grass didn't argue. The stones didn't ask questions. The harbor looked the same at 6 in the morning as it had looked from that rooftop, wide, dark, and indifferent to the things that happened near it. He put his medals in a coffee tin in the hall closet. He kept one thing visible, the sniper ink on his right forearm, crosshairs inside an oak wreath, Roman numerals beneath 11. 11 Tier 1 operations, the mark that fewer than 30 snipers in the entire history of naval special warfare had ever earned. He kept it because his father had told him that gifts were debts, and the ink was how he remembered what he owed. Grimes had been watching Marcus for 20 minutes before he sat down. Not obviously. Not the way Davenport watched, appraising, dismissive, looking for confirmation of a conclusion already reached. Grimes watched the way operators watch peripheral patient processing without broadcasting. He had spent 30 years in naval special warfare, learning that the most important information in any room was never at the center of it. It was always at the edges, always in the person nobody else was paying attention to. He pulled out the chair across from Marcus and sat down without asking. "You chose that spot on purpose," he said. Not a greeting, not an introduction. A statement of fact delivered to see what it produced. Marcus looked at him, said nothing. Back to the glass. Clear sight lines to both exits, the main stage and the VIP table. Nobody approaches from your 6 without crossing open floor first. Grimes settled into the chair with the ease of a man who had sat in worse places and planned to stay. That's not how civilians stand at parties. "I'm just here for the evening," Marcus said. Grimes nodded slowly, the nod of a man filing information rather than accepting an answer. He didn't push. He didn't probe. He simply sat, and that itself was a kind of communication. Two people trained in the art of stillness, occupying the same space without demanding anything from it. "Leonard Grimes," he said after a moment. "Master Chief retired. 30 years NSW. Started as a breacher on Team 4, finished as senior enlisted at the command level." He paused. "Saw what happened earlier." "It's handled," Marcus said. "Davenport's been like that since OCS," Grimes said, as if Marcus hadn't spoken. "Brilliant operator, genuinely. One of the best tactical minds I've worked alongside. And he has never once, not in 34 years, considered the possibility that a room might contain someone he hadn't already categorized." He looked at his water glass. "Men like that don't change until something forces the change. Usually it has to be public. Usually it has to be large." Marcus said nothing. Grimes looked at him, not at his suit, not at his lack of ribbons, not at any of the things Davenport had used as ammunition. He looked at his hands. The way they rested on the table, completely still, fingers slightly curved, weight distributed evenly across the palm. Not the hands of a man at rest. The hands of a man at ready. He looked at the way Marcus was sitting. Spine straight, shoulders square, weight balanced forward on both feet even while seated. The posture that meant I can be moving in any direction within a single second. The posture that didn't come from a desk. He looked at the room scan pattern, Marcus's eyes moving in a quiet, regular sweep across the space every 12 to 15 seconds, hitting the exits, the entry points, the elevated positions near the stage. Grimes had been counting. He'd clocked 6 complete scans in the time since he sat down. "I know what support looks like," Grimes said quietly. "I've worked alongside support for 30 years. Support doesn't sit like that. Support doesn't scan like that." He paused. "And support doesn't have trigger hands." Marcus looked at him. "Completely still," Grimes said. "No fidgeting, no micro movements. Hands that have held a fixed position for hours without twitching. I've sat across from maybe 400 operators in my career. I know what the other thing looks like." He held Marcus's gaze. "You're the other thing." Something moved behind Marcus's eyes, not confirmation, not denial, the slight shift of a man deciding how much of a door to open. "I'm just here for the evening," he said again. Grimes let it go. He turned back to the room. They sat together in the particular silence of two people who understood the same things and didn't need to perform their understanding for each other. At the front of the room, the podium lights came up. Vice Admiral Charles Davenport took the stage. He moved to the microphone with the ease of a man who had given 1,000 speeches and enjoyed every single one. The spotlight found him, and he smiled wide, practiced the smile that made donors write checks and junior officers nod in unconscious synchrony. He gripped the podium with both hands and let the room settle into attention before he began. "Tonight," Davenport said, We honor sacrifice. We honor the brotherhood forged in places most people will never see and can never fully understand. We honor the men, the warriors who have given everything this country has ever asked of them, and then found ways to give more. Grimes's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. This room represents the finest that American military service has ever produced. Every person at these tables has bled for something larger than themselves. Every single one of them earned their place here. He paused. His eyes drifted slowly, deliberately toward the back of the room, toward the far table near the windows, toward the black man in the plain, dark suit who had no ribbons on his chest and no rank on his collar. The corner of Davenport's mouth moved, every single one of them. A beat. The smile widened by exactly 1 degree, more or less. The laughter that followed was the worst kind, not loud, not committed, just present. The laughter of 200 people choosing the comfort of a powerful man's approval over the discomfort of what they had just heard. It lasted 4 seconds and then dissolved back into the ambient noise of the room. At the bar, Ensign Kevin Tran straightened up. His mouth opened. Something moved across his face, recognition, anger, the beginning of a word. Then his eyes moved to the VIP table, to Davenport, still at the podium, to the rows of senior officers between him and the stage. His mouth closed. He picked up his glass and looked at the floor. That was Rage Beat 3. And then, as Captain Howell returned to the podium and began sorting her papers for the recognition ceremony, Beckett leaned across the VIP table toward Ashford, 3 bourbons and no remaining awareness of his own volume, and said, "Ghost story, classified file. You know how many of these mystery hero nominations are just political quota fills? Somebody somewhere needed a checkbox. Watch." Ashford didn't respond. He was already looking at the back table. He was already beginning to run the numbers. Female, no wrong. Black male, NSW, no uniform. The way he stood, the way he scanned the room. His face had gone slightly pale, but Beckett was still smiling. Grimes beside Marcus said nothing. He just looked at the stage where Captain Howell was straightening her papers, and then he said very quietly, without turning his head, "They're about to call your name." Marcus looked at him. "Aren't they?" Grimes said. Still not a question. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. His right hand resting on the table was completely still. "Yeah," he said. "They are." Captain Sandra Howell adjusted the microphone, once looked out at the room, and began. "Ladies and gentlemen, what I'm about to read is not a summary. It is a service record, and I want you to hear every word of it." The room, which had been settling back into its ambient noise after Davenport's speech, went quiet again. Something in Howell's tone produced the quiet, not authority exactly, but weight. The specific gravity of a person who knows that what they are about to say matters and is not going to perform around it. The veteran we are honoring tonight enlisted at 18. He completed the Navy Scout Sniper Pipeline, the first black man from the rural South to do so, finishing at the top of his class in every evaluated discipline. At the VIP table, Davenport reached for his whiskey glass. His hand found it. He did not drink. He served 14 years in naval special warfare, 3 deployments, 11 classified Tier 1 operations, a number that places him among fewer than 30 snipers in the entire documented history of this branch. A murmur moved through the room. Not loud. The kind of murmur that happens when 200 people simultaneously recalibrate something. He holds the longest confirmed kill distance in NSW history. 2,280 yards. Nighttime. 23-mile-per-hour crosswind. Through a 4-inch aperture in reinforced concrete. The murmur became something larger. An admiral at the table nearest the stage leaned toward his aide. The aide was already doing math on his program with a pen. His most significant achievement remains classified at a level requiring joint congressional and Secretary of the Navy authorization to access. What I am authorized to tell you is this. Howell looked up from her papers. On a night that 8 men in this room remember with complete clarity, this veteran operating alone outside authorized engagement parameters, with no communications and no confirmed friendly positions, engaged 4 hostile targets in 16 seconds from a distance of 1,640 yards. 4 shots. 4 kills. The ambush broke. Every man on that team walked out of that harbor district alive. The room had stopped entirely. Glasses sat untouched. Conversations that had been quietly continuing at the peripheral tables had ceased. Even the waiters had stilled trays balanced, watching the stage. At the VIP table, Davenport's glass was no longer moving. His hand was flat on the tablecloth. His face had changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but the way a structure changes when something load-bearing shifts. The color was leaving it in slow degrees. Beckett's bourbon glass was suspended halfway to his lips. He had stopped moving at the words, 8 men in this room. Ashford had already done the arithmetic. He was sitting very still, looking at the tablecloth, his face the particular gray of a man watching something irreversible approach. His call sign, Howell said, within the special warfare community was Phantom. The word dropped through the room like a stone into still water. Most of the audience heard a dramatic name, a story element, something that would make the video montage compelling at the end of the evening. At the VIP table, 3 men heard something else entirely, Phantom, the call sign they had filed requests about for 14 years. The name attached to the sealed file that had been denied through FOI. A requests, congressional inquiries, back-channel conversations with people who owed them favors. The shooter on the rooftop that none of them had ever been able to identify, whose face none of them had ever seen, whose name none of them had ever learned. Davenport's chair moved. Not much. An inch back from the table. His hands were pressing flat against the white linen with the focused pressure of a man trying to stop the room from rotating. Beckett set his glass down. The sound it made, small, precise, the click of crystal on linen, was the loudest thing in the room. Ashford turned toward the back of the ballroom. Slowly. The way you turn when you already know what you're going to see and are not ready to see it. His eyes found the far table near the windows. The black man in the dark suit. The man Davenport had patted on the shoulder like a lost child. The man he himself had dismissed with 8 words and a sideways glance. His face drained. His name, Captain Howell said, straightening her papers one final time, is Marcus Elijah Webb. 200 heads turned at once. Marcus stood. The chair scraped against the marble floor, the only sound in a room that had compressed itself into total silence. He buttoned the single button on his jacket. He set his water glass on the table. And he walked. His pace was even, unhurried. The same pace he had maintained on every approach to every position he had ever held. No performance. No acknowledgement of the 200 faces tracking him across the room. Just forward motion, steady grounded the walk of a man who has been where he has been and does not need to announce it. He passed the colonel who had studied his plate. The man was staring now, fork frozen in midair, mouth slightly open. He passed the commander's wife who had touched her husband's arm in warning. She was gripping it now for a different reason. He passed Ensign Kevin Tran at the bar. Tran was standing fully upright, his drink forgotten on the counter behind him, his hands at his sides, his eyes red. He passed Beckett. Beckett had not moved. The bourbon glass was still on the table where he'd set it down, and Beckett was staring at the tablecloth with the expression of a man reviewing the last hour of his life and finding it catastrophic. He passed Ashford. Ashford could not look up, and then he passed Davenport. The Vice Admiral was sitting with both hands flat on the table chair, pushed back, knees not quite steady. His face had completed its transition from command to something older and raw, the face of a man standing at the edge of a 14-year calculation that had just resolved itself in the worst possible way. As Marcus passed close enough that Davenport could have reached out and touched him, Marcus's right cuff shifted. A quarter inch, maybe less. The chandelier light caught the sniper ink on his forearm. Crosshairs. Oak wreath. Roman numerals. 11. Davenport saw it. His brain processed the image the way it processed threats in the field, automatically, completely, before permission was granted. The tattoo. The mark. The ink that fewer than 30 men in the history of naval special warfare had ever earned. The ink that appeared in the classified file description of call sign Phantom identifying mark, right forearm, a detail that had been in the sealed record for 14 years, a detail that Davenport had memorized in the first week after the file was denied and had never forgotten. The rooftop, the harbor, the drainage channel, 2253. The sound of incoming fire ceasing from 3 directions simultaneously. The extraction corridor opening like a door in the dark. The man who had done that had just walked past him. The man he had called a janitor. The man he had patted on the shoulder. Davenport's hands began to shake. It started in the fingers, a fine, uncontrollable vibration that traveled up through his wrists and into his forearms. The crystal glass on the table rattled against its base. Marcus reached the stage. He climbed the 3 steps without holding the railing. He stood at the podium, and he looked out at the room, 200 faces, 200 people who had watched him be handed an empty glass and told to find somewhere quiet to stand. And he said nothing. He simply stood there, waiting. Marcus stood at the podium and did not speak. He had no prepared remarks. He had not written anything down on the drive over, had not rehearsed anything in the mirror that morning, had not spent any part of the previous 3 weeks since the invitation arrived, thinking about what he would say if he stood in front of 200 people in a room like this. He had spent those 3 weeks thinking about whether to come at all. He looked out at the room the way he looked at every space he occupied completely, without performance, taking inventory of what was actually there rather than what was supposed to be there. What was actually there was this 200 officers who had watched a man be diminished in public and had chosen collectively and individually to let it happen. Some had looked away. Some had laughed. Some had done the particular thing that was in certain ways worse than either they had simply continued their conversations, as if the volume of their own voices could retroactively cover what they had permitted. Marcus looked at them without anger, without triumph, with the same flat, clear-eyed assessment he applied to distances and wind speeds and the geometry of a shot that needed to go exactly where it needed to go. Captain Howell stepped forward and extended the framed citation with both hands. Marcus took it, nodded once, held it against his chest. The room was still completely silent. 200 people waiting for a speech, for a rebuke, for something that would give them a script to follow. He gave them nothing. He simply stood there, spine straight, hands steady, the same posture he had held on a rooftop for 11 hours before he ever pulled a trigger and let the silence do the work that silence is uniquely qualified to do. Then he looked at Davenport, not with anger, not with the satisfaction of a man who has been vindicated in public and wants the room to know it. He looked at him the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray, clinical, precise, seeing what was broken underneath the surface without requiring the patient to perform their injury for an audience. It was that look that broke him. Not the revelation, not the applause that was coming, not the accumulated weight of 14 years of searching resolving itself in a single evening. It was being looked at clearly, directly, without hostility and without mercy, by the man he had tried to make invisible. Davenport pushed back from the VIP table. The chair legs caught on the marble and screeched. The sound cut through the silence like something tearing. Ashford reached for his arm. Davenport shook him off without looking at him. He stood up. His dress whites, which had looked immaculate on the stage an hour ago, looked different now. The same fabric, the same ribbons, but the man inside them was standing differently. The certainty was gone. The weight of 34 years of unexamined authority had shifted, and the body carrying it had not yet learned to compensate. He stepped out from behind the VIP table. Every eye in the room followed him. He walked to the center of the ballroom floor and stopped, 12 feet from the stage. He looked up at Marcus, the black man, in the dark suit, who had no medals on his chest and no rank on his collar, and for a moment he simply stood there, the way Marcus had stood there, carrying something he didn't yet know how to put down. Then Vice Admiral Charles Davenport came to attention. Full regulation. Feet together. Spine locked. Chin up. The posture so deeply embedded in 34 years of muscle memory that it arrived without conscious instruction, but this time it wasn't the attention of a man asserting his authority over a room. It was something older and more fundamental than rank. It was one human being acknowledging another. He raised his hand. Full regulation salute, held steady at his brow arm perfectly level. His voice came out rough, fractured at the edges. The microphone on the podium caught it and carried it to every corner of the room. "I owe you my life," Davenport said. "I owe you 8 lives." He held the salute. His arm trembled slightly. His eyes were wet. "And 40 minutes ago, I asked your rank like it was a joke." The room did not move. 200 people suspended in the specific stillness that arrives when something true and irreversible has been said in public, and there is no walking it back. At the bar, Ensign Kevin Tron was crying. Not quietly, not with any attempt at composure. The tears were simply there, running down his face, and he made no move to stop them. The Brigadier General, who had turned his shoulder away earlier in the evening, was on his feet. His hands came together. One pair of hands clapping in a silent room is a different thing from applause. It is a decision, public and unambiguous. Then the colonel who had studied his plate stood up. Then the commander's wife. Then a table near the stage. Then 2 tables. Then the sound built, the way sounds build in large rooms when something has shifted and everyone feels the shift. Simultaneously, chairs, scraping hands, coming together, the noise rising and rising until it reached the chandeliers, and the chandeliers had nothing to offer it but their own light. Marcus looked down at Davenport from the stage. The salute was still held. The arm was still trembling. Marcus raised his right hand. Clean, precise, full regulation, the salute of a man who had earned the right to give it 11 times over in 11 places whose names he could not speak in a bar. He held it for 3 seconds. Then he brought it down. The applause lasted 4 full minutes. Marcus stood at the podium and let it happen around him, not performing gratitude, not performing humility, just standing still, the way he had always stood still, present and grounded, and exactly where he was supposed to be. Davenport stood in the center of the ballroom floor, with tears running down his face, and did not wipe them away. The balcony off the 4th floor overlooked Charleston Harbor. At 9:47 on a Friday evening in October, the water was dark and flat, broken at intervals by the running lights of vessels moving in the shipping channel, slow red and green points of light, crossing the black surface with the unhurried certainty of things that knew exactly where they were going. The air smelled of salt and diesel and the particular dampness of a coastal city that had never quite dried out from its last rain. Marcus stood at the stone railing with the framed citation beside him, and his hands finally, for the first time all evening, shaking. Not from anger, not from the applause that had followed him off the stage and through the handshakes and the nods and the Brigadier General, who had held his hand in both of his and said, "I watched what happened earlier, and I did nothing. And that is on me." And Marcus had said thank you for saying that, because it was the right thing to say, and also because he meant it, not from any of that, from the cost of holding still for that long, from the specific exhaustion of absorbing every word and every laugh, and every glance and every deliberate diminishment, and returning nothing but silence and steadiness. The sniper's discipline. Hold position. Hold breath. Hold the thing that wants to break until the moment that matters arrives. It worked in the field. It worked in the ballroom. But there was always a cost that arrived afterward, in the quiet, when the mission was over, and the body finally understood that it was allowed to feel what it had been carrying. His hands were shaking. He let them. He had been on the balcony for 6 minutes when he heard the door open behind him. Footsteps. Measured. Slower than usual, the walk of a man who was not certain of his reception and was moving accordingly. Davenport stepped onto the balcony and stopped 6 feet away. He had removed his dress jacket. Without it, without the ribbons, without the stars, without the white fabric that announced everything he was supposed to be, he looked like what he actually was, a 58-year-old man who had just been forced to see something clearly for the first time and was still processing the view. He didn't speak immediately. He looked at the harbor, at the running lights, at the dark water. "I don't know where to start," he said. "Then don't," Marcus said. "I have to." Silence. The harbor sounds filled it, the distant clang of rigging, the low pulse of a generator from a docked vessel, the occasional cry of a gull working the waterline. "What I did in there," Davenport said. "What I said. That's not—" He stopped, shook his head, started again. "No. That's exactly who I am. That's who I've been. I'm not going to stand here and tell you it was out of character because it wasn't. It was completely in character. That's the part I have to live with." Marcus said nothing. "I've looked for Phantom for 14 years, Davenport said. His voice had dropped to something that was working hard to stay level and not entirely succeeding. 14 years, filed every request available to me. FOIA, congressional inquiries, favors from people who owed me things I'd spent decades accumulating. Sat in offices at the Pentagon and asked people to unseal that file so I could find the person who kept 8 men alive and say thank you." He paused. "Tonight, I found him standing alone at a gala. And instead of thanking him, his voice broke. He pressed his fist against his mouth and breathed through it for a moment. 'I told a black man who saved my life to find somewhere else to stand.' The words went out into the harbor air and did not come back. "The worst part," Davenport said when he could speak again, "isn't that I didn't know who you were. It's that even if you weren't Phantom, even if you were exactly what I decided you were when I looked at you, what I did would still be unforgivable. You didn't need a classified service record to deserve basic human decency. And I couldn't manage that. I couldn't give you that." Marcus was quiet for a long time. The harbor moved below them. A container ship, enormous and slow and indifferent, was making its way toward the channel mouth, its running lights painting 2 long smears of color across the dark water. "That night in the harbor district," Marcus said finally, "I didn't know who you were either. Didn't know your name. Didn't know your rank or your record or anything you'd done or failed to do. All I knew was that you were in that drainage channel and you had about 4 minutes left." He looked at the water. "I didn't save you because of what you'd earned. I saved you because you were a person who needed help. That's the whole thing. That's the entire calculation." Davenport closed his eyes. A tear tracked down the left side of his face. He didn't wipe it away. "I'm going to file for declassification of your service record," he said, Full disclosure, every operation, every commendation. I'm going to make 4 trips to Washington if that's what it takes. That's not why I came tonight, Marcus said. I know, Davenport said. But it's what's going to happen anyway. Because people like you don't get to stay invisible anymore. Not after tonight. Not on my watch. In the doorway behind them, Marcus heard the quiet shift of weight someone who had been there long enough to have heard most of it. He didn't need to turn to know. Grimes, standing at the doorway with his hands in his pockets and a small, unhurried smile on his face. The smile of a man who had been patient all evening and found the patience entirely justified. Davenport extended his hand. Not the 2-second transaction from the ballroom. An open hand offered slowly, with nothing behind it except what it was. Marcus looked at it, looked at him. Then he took it, one handshake. Firm, brief, and inside it, apology, shame, gratitude, and the fragile, uncertain, entirely real possibility that a person can change when they are finally forced to see clearly what they have been looking at all along. Davenport nodded once. Then he turned and walked back inside. Grimes watched him go. Then he looked at Marcus. Hell of a night, he said. Yeah, Marcus said. He picked up the citation from the railing, held it against his chest. The harbor moved below them. The running lights kept going slow, steady, knowing exactly where they were headed. 7 months later, a sealed file began to open. It took Davenport 4 trips to Washington. 2 appearances before a joint congressional subcommittee. 14 hours of testimony across 3 separate sessions, most of which was classified, and none of which was comfortable. It took a personal letter, 14 pages, single-spaced, addressed directly to the Secretary of the Navy, hand-delivered by Davenport himself to an office in the Pentagon on a Tuesday morning in April. The letter contained operational details, procedural history, and a formal argument for declassification that 3 different JAG officers had reviewed and approved. But the sentence that every journalist, every veterans organization, and eventually every major news outlet would reproduce in full was buried on page 11, between a procedural footnote and a formal citation request. I have spent 34 years believing I earned the life I have. I was wrong. A man I called a janitor earned it for me, and I repaid him by asking his rank like it was a joke. The Navy Times ran the story on a Thursday morning. Front page, above the fold. The headline read, "Phantom Unmasked, the sniper who saved 8 SEALs and went back to cutting grass." The photograph that accompanied it had been taken by a staff photographer from the Charleston Post and Courier, who had driven out to the Veterans Memorial Park on the waterfront at 5:30 in the morning before the park opened, because Marcus had agreed to exactly 1 photograph and exactly 0 interviews, and had specified that it needed to be finished before the first visitors arrived. The photograph showed Marcus standing on the path that ran along the harbor-facing wall of the memorial. He was wearing work clothes, the dark green uniform of the park's groundskeeping staff. He was holding a rake in his right hand. The harbor was behind him, still dark at that hour, the lights of the far shore reflected in long, broken lines across the water. He was not posing. He was not smiling. He was simply standing the way he always stood, present, grounded, still looking at the camera with the flat, clear-eyed directness of a man who had nothing left to prove to anyone. The article went online at 6:14 in the morning. By 6:14 that evening, it had 31 million views. The comments section became its own event, arguments about the confirmed kill distance, debates about the 67-hour hold, veterans sharing service accounts, civilians trying to understand the classification system, people who had never met Marcus Webb writing about him in the present tense, as if they knew him. The thread about the 94.2-degree core temperature alone ran to 4,000 replies, split almost evenly between people who called it physiologically impossible and people who cited cold water immersion studies and ranger school data in its defense. Marcus didn't read any of it. He had no social media accounts. He did not own a television. When the Navy Times called his cell phone, he let it go to voicemail. When CNN's Washington bureau sent a producer to the park on a Friday afternoon, Marcus listened to the request, thanked her for coming, and said no thank you, with a quietness that apparently communicated finality because the producer did not return. When the Pentagon called with a consulting position, GS-15 equivalent advisory role, Special Operations Command, start date. Flexible, Marcus said. I appreciate the offer and went back to work. The grass needed cutting. The stones needed cleaning. The harbor looked the same at 6 in the morning as it had always looked. Davenport changed. Not the way it happens in movies, not the tear, the montage, the new man arriving fully formed by the final scene. He changed the way people actually change when they have been forced to look clearly at what they have been and found it insufficient slowly, painfully, in small increments that accumulated over months into something that was genuinely different from what had come before. He launched a mentorship pipeline for Black and minority candidates entering NSW selection, funded entirely from his personal finances, staffed by veterans he recruited individually, built around the specific structural barriers that Marcus's own recruiter had tried to use as walls. He gave speeches, different speeches, not the brotherhood rhetoric, not the men who serve language, but something more honest and more careful. He stopped performing his record and started examining it. In meetings and briefings in the rooms where he still carried weight, he corrected himself. The people who serve. Small words. The kind of correction that doesn't make headlines. The kind that reshapes the air in rooms without announcing the reshaping. He and Marcus spoke twice a year. Brief calls never longer than 10 minutes, always initiated by Davenport, always received with the same measured quiet. Not friendship, not repair in the full sense of the word. Something more precise than either the connection of two people bound together by a harbor district and a ballroom, each of which had revealed something the other needed to see, whether they had wanted to see it or not. Ensign Kevin Tron submitted a transfer request to sniper qualification training 6 weeks after the gala. His transfer letter was 3 paragraphs long. The final paragraph contained one sentence. I opened my mouth at the gala and closed it. I am done closing it. He was accepted. Phase 1 began the following spring. Marcus still tends the memorial park. Still drives his father's old pickup, a 1987 Ford F-150, that required 3 repairs in the last year and would require more. Still runs the Tuesday and Thursday afternoon archery program at the community center on Meeting Street, 10 to 14 years old, mixed group. About 60% of them kids who had never held a bow before they walked through the door. The ones who stayed long enough got good. The ones who stayed longer than that got quiet, the productive quiet, the kind that comes from learning to hold still and wait for the moment that matters. He told them what his father had told him: one shot, one answer. Everything else is noise. On his kitchen table sat 2 things: the framed citation from the gala, and a photograph, not the Navy Times photograph, not the one 31 million people had seen. A different one taken by Grimes on his cell phone at 11:47 that same evening, before anyone had thought to take anything official. In it, Vice Admiral Charles Davenport stands at attention, in the center of a ballroom floor, arm raised in full salute, tears visible on his face. Marcus Webb stands above him on the stage, dark suit, no medals, no ribbons, returning the salute. His right cuff is shifted slightly. The sniper ink is visible on his forearm. Crosshairs inside an oak wreath. Roman numerals. 11. He had earned every one of them. He had just never told anyone. He didn't need to. The work was the record. The record was enough. Marcus Webb never asked for a stage. He never asked for recognition, for declassification, for an apology, for any of it. He walked into that room carrying everything he had ever done quietly, completely, without announcement, and he let the truth be what it was. Dignity is not something a room can give you. It is what you carry in when you walk through the door. And no one, no laugh, no pat on the shoulder, no carefully aimed dismissal can take back what a person has already become. If this story reached something in you, drop your city and your local time in the comments. I want to know where in the world this landed. And if you've made it this far and you're not subscribed yet, you already know what kind of stories live here.